Managing Violence Podcast, Season 5, Episode 4, with Dr. Rodney King. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. Today, my guest is a little bit of an underground legend when it comes to modern martial arts, and that is Dr. Rodney King of South Africa. Rodney is most well known as the founder of Crazy Monkey Boxing, also Crazy Monkey Defense, and Monkey Jits. He is a very well-credentialed martial artist, as well as having grown up around violence in South Africa. And he also did a PhD in embodied leadership, which we will get onto as we get into things. Not only a martial artist, but also an academic and a great mind when it comes to violence prevention and self-defense. So without further ado, here is Dr. Rodney King. All right, I'm joined by Dr. Rodney King. Thanks for joining us, Rodney. It's been a little while in the making that we started organising this, and we're finally here. And thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, we all have a little bit of time up our sleeves. So good to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we were talking a little bit offline, right? I'm stranded in the Isle of Man right now, so I could be in a worse place. It's a beautiful place to be stuck, so I'm not complaining.
Yeah, it's certainly people have it harder, but still, being stuck anywhere is always a bit of a challenge. So, Rodney, for those that don't know much about you, I mean, certainly in the martial arts world, I think you're probably best known as the creator of Crazy Monkey Defense or Crazy Monkey Boxing, initially. But for those that may not be familiar with your story, let's start at the beginning. How did you get started in all this world of martial arts and violence management?
Well, yeah, it's a long story. So can I give you the Cliff Notes version?
You can. We've got an hour. We've got an hour.
Yeah. Well, the story might take an hour. No, just kidding. So, I mean, the basic story, if I give you the Cliff Notes version, I was brought up in the south side of Johannesburg, which is like government housing in South Africa. Those kinds of neighborhoods, as typically there are anywhere in the world, are rife with violence. I was being picked on all the time. I was being bullied. I was, in a house that wasn't safe either. My mother was a raging, abusive alcoholic. So early on, I started thinking about how can I actually protect myself? How am I actually going to be able to defend myself in this kind of environment? And at the same time, I was very much, as a young kid, like even as far back as I can remember, probably like 6 years old, I was already fascinated by martial arts movies. And so that seemed like the solution, right? Train martial arts. If you do that, then you're going to be able to protect yourself. And that really just set me on the road, just thinking about how I can actually train, how I can get involved in it. I did whatever I needed to do to learn. And, as most kids at that time, there wasn't a lot of options, especially not in South Africa. So I went to the first thing that I could find, which happened to be karate. And I spent a long time training in karate, all the way up actually till after I finished my military service. I was still doing that. And then after military service, which at the time was compulsory, and while I was in the military, I was part of the VIP protection wing. So it's the close protection wing. It's part of the military police. I was the platoon sergeant of my unit. I eventually became the lead hand-to-hand combat instructor for my unit. And then once I got out of the military, I didn't really have any skills, because if I just back it up just a little bit, the basic way that I got into the military was out of just having no choice. I was about 17 years old. My mother kicked me out of the house. I was sleeping on a park bench. Basically, it came down to the fact that she was just in a rage. She was completely drunk. She told me to go, and I went. And so I found myself just sleeping on the streets of Johannesburg. And I had nowhere to go. And the only place that I could go, the only place I could find that would take me in was the army. I mean, in those days, you had to go to the army. It was compulsory. So I forged my mother's signature, and I entered the military at 17. I turned 18 in the army. And so that was kind of why I ended up there. And once I got out of the army, even though I'd been training karate and I was the lead hand-to-hand combat instructor for my unit, like I said, and I had those skills, the military skills, nobody would hire me. I just wasn't going to find a job, at least not in the normal kind of corporate environment. So the only thing I could find was working the door. And so I started bouncing, probably around 20 years old, and I did that for several years. And while I was doing that, I was training in everything and anything I could get my hands on, mostly in Muay Thai. So I spent over a decade traveling back and forwards to Thailand. I trained with a very famous Muay Thai teacher that has sadly passed away, Apidej Sitarung. And I trained with him at Fairtex for a long time. And one of the very few people that was ever given permission to teach under his name, which is an honor. And really the thing that informed my martial arts journey was really that time working in the door, because that's where I really started to fully understand the dynamics of interpersonal violence. And that was the kind of the impetus for what ultimately became the Crazy Monkey Defense martial arts system, which is what most people know me for.
Mm, very interesting. So the oftentimes when people talk about military service, we're talking people that have made a conscious choice to join the military for some higher calling, whereas you kind of found yourself there based on survival or compulsory service. So it's an interesting starting point. I guess in a way, given your background, it must have been kind of nice to have stability of some sort.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is, I have to credit being in the Army for teaching me what it meant to be a leader. Because when I entered into my military service, that was like the last thing from my mind. Like you said, I was just there to get a place to sleep, get 3 meals a day, and get off the street. But actually in the military and being part of the South African Defence Force really taught me what it was to be a leader, and I excelled at it. And I was quite surprised actually that I did so well, because that's not the experience I had growing up. I was the kid that was always afraid of violence, always running away from situations because I didn't want to get involved in them. I wasn't the best student at school. I just didn't do really well in the academic environment. And so once I got into the military, things started changing. And clearly that, the people that were in charge of me and the people that I had to, be underneath had seen that, there's something in this young guy, and they groomed me. And like I said, ultimately I became a platoon sergeant in charge of the unit. And that was kind of my first foray into developing leadership skills. So if anything, I owe the South African Defence Force for that.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's fast forward. You're working on the doors, you're training Muay Thai, and you said that you've identified some gaps, or the starting to understand the dynamics of interpersonal violence, and you get to developing Crazy Monkey. So for those that have never seen Crazy Monkey or don't know anything about it, what is Crazy Monkey Defense? Did it start off just as a boxing style and evolve, or is it always more holistic than that?
I think it's always been more holistic, but the thing that stands out in Crazy Monkey is the focus on what we could call Western boxing, but it's the way that we do it and the way we deliver it isn't a kind of a competitive sport mindset. It's coming more from applied to self-preservation, to the street. That's the one thing I didn't mention, is that's the other thing I did, especially during my karate years, was that I was training Western boxing as well. I trained under a very famous boxing coach, Willie Tawil. I was there for several years. I competed in boxing. I did okay. And I competed in karate too, and I did all right. I was never the best competitor. It was never the thing that I enjoyed. And then once I got working the door, I found that was kind of my niche. That was what I was really good at. I was really good at dealing with interpersonal violence. I didn't like the buildup of competition. I didn't like, thinking about having to get into a ring for weeks on end. That's just the thing that just really just deflated me. But being in a situation when you didn't know when it was going to happen and then suddenly it was in your face, that kind of appealed to me. And I felt that I did really well in that kind of environment. So Crazy Monkey Defense was really, in the beginning, an amalgamation of the different things that I trained, some Western boxing, some Muay Thai, some karate that I had done, anything else that I could find. But I quickly kind of started to realize that a lot of the stuff that we do, especially in the martial arts world, where for example, in karate, we did 1 and 3 step sparring. It was very, very common. Or we would do self-defense techniques. Person does this and then you do X. There's always this kind of set out ritualistic approach to it. It was always methodical. It was always, you knew what was going to happen and then you protected yourself against it. I should have known better, right, growing up the way that I did, but it wasn't until I was actually in the doors and working the doors that I realized, holy shit, it just doesn't go down that way. And actually most of the stuff that you learn in this kind of predefined way just goes out the window. And so there are elements within those kinds of environments that are very clear if you've been in them. They're chaotic, they're unpredictable, there's resistance. People don't just go down when you do something. They actually fight back, funny enough. And we could talk about that. It's one of my pet peeves when I'm on YouTube and I watch what's pushed all the time in the reality-based self-defense stuff. It looks great as a Hollywood choreography, but at the end of the day, there's a glaring problem there. And the glaring problem is, if you look very carefully in almost every single video, without exception, even those people who claim to be experts in the world of reality-based self-defense, they're demonstrating techniques against attacks that they already know that are coming, and the other guy or woman never hits back afterwards. So they throw that first initial strike, that first initial attack, and then it stops, and then you don't see anything. And then the expert or the person defending themselves goes into their Jason Bourne sequence and eliminates the threat in front of them. Well, working the door, I figured out that doesn't work that way, right? And that a lot of times, actually, you may be trying to fight from a losing position, not from a winning position. So Crazy Monkey Defense really came from that exploration of looking deeply into the realm of interpersonal violence, what actually happens, and how would you train for it. So in a nutshell, yes, it's a Western boxing base with lots of other elements to it. It's primarily Western boxing, but it's more of a street boxing approach. And the thing that I've always done is I've always made sure that I've balanced it between the combat athletic side of it, which is what a lot of people term as sport, versus the street side of it, or the self-preservation side. And I think they go hand in hand, and they need to both be there in order to effectively defend yourself. And for example, we just as I'm talking, I'm saying, okay, sometimes you're going to be in a losing position and you have to learn how to come back from that. Well, that's very hard to do in prearranged drills, but definitely something that you learn in combat sports.
Absolutely.
Because you're not winning all the time. And I'm not saying you have to go and compete. I'm just saying, just in the experience, I do jiu-jitsu, for example. I've been doing that for a very long time. I spar all the time, and you're not always in the winning position. And so what that does is, what it teaches you is how to actually develop the resilience and the grit that's necessary in order to come back when you're in an unfavorable position. No set out self-defense sequence is ever going to allow you to do that. And so even though we can argue that, maybe some of the techniques are valid, the methodology, the approach that they take isn't, because fights never go down like that. So Crazy Monkey Defense is ultimately a street system. It's developed for that. That's where it came from, and it evolved in my time working the doors.
Yeah. I first came across your work kind of through a third party, I guess. Maybe 12 or 13 years ago, I was watching a very low resolution promo clip, because it was pre-YouTube, I think, of the guys from ISR Matrix in the US. And one of the guys in their promo clip was doing this crazy boxing routine in a hallway where he kept touching his head and looked like he was had a palm on his head the whole time. And as a martial artist, I was like, what is he doing? I've never seen that before. And I started asking around, and someone said, oh, that's Crazy Monkey. And I was like, what the hell's Crazy Monkey? I thought it was like some kung fu style I hadn't heard of. And so I started digging, and as luck would have it, I still didn't really know what I was searching for. But as luck would have it, I did a seminar with Richard Norton here in Australia. And Richard actually covered a little bit of Crazy Monkey that he'd picked up from you. I know he knows you fairly well.
Richard's a great guy. He's an awesome guy.
Oh, amazing martial artist as well.
Absolutely.
Richard, quick sidetrack, but Richard for a long time was the prototype in my mind of what a martial artist should be. He has this grace and elegance about him, and he moves so incredibly well, and he's a nice guy, and everything about Richard Norton is impressive. I'm trying to get him on the podcast later on, now that he's in lockdown too and can't travel. But anyway, back to your story. I came across it then, and what I was most intrigued about is, at the time I was also working on the doors, and I had done a little bit of Western boxing. I was primarily a grappler, but I'd done a little bit of Western boxing. And one of the things that I found didn't translate well was that when I was striking, I was used to wearing gloves. And I found that the defense mechanism of Crazy Monkey was quite interesting. and I actually explored that with an instructor here in Australia called Ray Floro. Ray incorporated elements of Crazy Monkey into his empty hand boxing, and with a little bit of a Filipino influence. So
yeah, and Ray, and there's another guy, right? Ray's a great guy too.
Oh yeah,
two good guys.
Oh, yeah. Fantastic! Yeah. Ray's actually been on the podcast before. I've spent a lot of hours training with Ray, and being fearful for my life while he giggled at me. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that transition, or I guess what sporting strikers need to know to adapt their skills for reality, where there's no gloves. Hitting power is therefore compromised a little bit, and the defense is different. So what was the adaptation for you?
Well, I think it's yes and no, right? It just depends on how you're looking at it. I'm always coming from the perspective that I've actually been there, done it, and got the t-shirt. So I've actually been on the ground. I've actually had to defend myself. I've got into fights. Not that I necessarily wanted to, because nobody wants to do that work in the doors, but these things happen. And quickly, it was very evident to me, like I noted earlier, that everything that I'd learned in a more traditional framework, where at that time was one of the only places that you could really learn, quote unquote, self-defense techniques, didn't come to bear when you actually had to apply it. And I think the big part of the problem is that two things. One, the pedagogical approach that is used is incorrect, because as I said, fights are not going to be nicely defined. They're going to be chaotic and they're unpredictable. Second to that is, I think it's a misunderstanding a lot of times where people are teaching things out of context of reality. They say that they're teaching reality, but it's not reality. And I'll give you an example of that. Just like I can go up on YouTube and find terrible examples under the banner of self-defense or reality-based self-defense, and pretty much all the things I mentioned earlier and why I would say that it isn't really good, I can also go and find people getting into real fights. Well, we can argue the ethical side of that, but like it or not, there are people that put up compilations of people getting into fights all over the world. And that is my experience. When I think back to when the time I worked the door, it's no different. When I look at that, what do you see? What do you see them doing? You don't see them doing anything that the people teach on reality-based self-defense videos. What you see is bad boxing, bad grappling, bad kickboxing. It's all the elements that you would see in a sport environment coming out. So if, for example, this argument that's often bantered around a lot is saying, oh, you know what, we train for the street and those guys train, for sport. If that was true, then explain to me why when I do watch real fights, that's not what I'm seeing. And what I'm actually seeing is a very bad version of a sport fight. Now, with that said, I'm not saying that a combat athlete has all the necessary understanding of interpersonal threat management that he should have, because there are obviously drawbacks to that. And so you need to make adjustments. I might be using what might be viewed as a combat athletic base to defend myself, but I'm also applying other strategies at the same time. For example, I'm very well aware that I might be dealing with more than one opponent, which is something that is not something you never have to really, worry about in a sport environment. Right? If you're going to a boxing match, it's one-on-one. If it's MMA, it's one-on-one. If it's kickboxing, it's one-on-one, and so forth, right? But of course, now when you're actually out on the street, you have to deal with multiple opponents. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind. You have to be prepared for that. That means that you have to change the way that you use your visual acuity, where a lot of times in, combat sports, if, for example, I'm doing, say, a boxing match, I'm focusing purely 100% on the threat that's in front of me, which is the other opponent. But on a street environment, I have to have decentralized focus. I have to fight the fact that my body wants to go into that central focus. That's where my eyes want to go. It wants to immediately latch onto the immediate threat. But in doing that, what happens is I lose my peripheral vision and I'm not able to see what's happening around me. So I actually have to train for that on purpose. So while we can make the argument that in most fights, really what you see is a bad version of combat sports, the fact of the matter is, if you really want to put yourself in a position that you can actually survive those kinds of encounters, you have to change several things. And that's not so much about the physical technique as far as the punching and the kicking, but more so your mindset and the way that you approach it. So for example, like I said, knowing that it might be multiple opponents, knowing that my visual acuity is going to latch onto the immediate threat in front of me. So I'm going to go, central focus on that person. I'm going to lose peripheral vision. So I need to fight that because I need to be aware if there's any other threats in my environment. Of course, the sports side of it is what? We want to go rounds. That's basically what it is until we can ultimately beat the opponent. But in a self-preservation environment, I don't want to be there. And so my attitude should be only to do enough to get myself out of that situation and always move myself to a position of safety.
Yeah.
And so that's just on a periphery, a couple. I mean, obviously we could carry on. We could talk hours just on, what kind of changes we need to make. And then of course, once you make those changes, you have to train them purposefully. You have to make sure that they're part of your training.
Absolutely. One of the things that I quite enjoy about your approach, and we haven't even talked about the jiu-jitsu yet, but one of the things I quite enjoy about your approach is the incorporation of combat sport. And I started off with a traditional martial arts background, moved into combat sport primarily as an athlete, and then only started dabbling in the quote-unquote reality aspects once I started working the doors and I realized that there were gaps. But I'm a firm believer that combat sports are a better base for being able to manage the physicality of violence than any reality-based system is. And that's primarily due to the sparring and the resistance and being able to develop those attributes of being able to, whether it's control or strike or whatever it is, someone who's actively resisting and trying to harm you. I think that's is such a missing element, and even now as predominantly a Krav Maga guy, if you're not sparring, you're not doing Krav Maga. I've seen some places now that are teaching non-contact Krav Maga. I'm like, have you actually translated the Hebrew? It's contact combat. Like, I mean, how do you have non-contact contact combat? That doesn't really work, does it? But I think that element of incorporating the sparring, but then not letting it turn into, I guess, traditional sparring, like keeping your objectives in place. I remember as a young man, when I was still working the doors, I wanted to find that Mr. Miyagi moment where I would find the calm, traditional martial arts mind, and I'd balance some of the negative energies that are in my life, and I started looking for a very traditional system, and I came across a Goju-Ryu instructor who was high ranking and very lovely martial arts master. Like he had all the trappings that he was going to be my Mr. Miyagi, and I started training with him and quite enjoyed the environment. And after a few sessions, I asked, do you guys do any kumite? Do you do any sparring? And he said, oh, no, we don't spar here. And I said, oh, really? And he said, I used to spar, but it always just ends up looking like really bad kickboxing, so we don't spar anymore. And I thought, like, is that not a red flag that what you're teaching may not be working? If your students look like they're flailing fish in a barrel when they're sparring, does that give you any indication that potentially they're not going to manage a real fight any better? But I think that reluctance to add in resistance and aliveness, as Matt Thornton would say, is a major detriment to not only traditional martial artists but also the reality-based martial artists. And
I think Joe, you hit a lot of points there that I think are really important. Let me just say this, and it won't make me popular. One of the reasons why I think the sparring, for example, is taken out is because real self-defense doesn't sell. Let's just be honest. I mean, I'm also in the same predicament. I have to make a living from this. This is what I do for a living. So I've always got a balance between making a living on the one side, but being true to what I really believe needs to be done in order for people to learn how to protect themselves. And the interesting thing for me always is, and people can go do their own research on this, and this is like my kind of, what I've noticed across the board, is that when you look at a lot of these quote unquote, and we could put them just under this banner, reality-based self-defense schools, they happen to be in the middle upper class neighborhoods of the world. They are not in the neighborhoods of the world that are entrenched in violence. So the vast majority of their students I think, genuinely want to learn how to defend themselves, but because they don't come from an environment where they actually have to, first of all, they don't have any context, so you can sell them anything. Second of all, once you actually put them in that kind of place, in that situation, for example, like where you actually make it more real, it's going to bring up a lot of inside, kind of emotional turmoil, things that they're not necessarily going to find nice. It's going to be difficult to deal with. It's going to be uncomfortable. And people don't want that, because in order for you to work through that, you may have to accept that you're not as badass as you really think you are, that you're not as prepared as you think you are in order to defend yourself. And people don't like that. I mean, I can give you an example of just from my own experience, is that in the past, when I ran a very combat athletic based school, the second we got to the point where everybody started sparring, because the reality of sparring is you're going to get hit, by the next time we came in, half the class disappeared. and the reason is, this wasn't because of the pain of getting hit. It was more to do with psychologically and emotionally what came up in that moment in time that people found very difficult to deal with. So I think one of the reasons that you don't see the reality as we should see it is because deep down inside, many of these people teaching know that if they did that, they would have maybe a couple of students. It's very hard to fill a school like that. It's just not going to happen. And nobody wants to talk about it. I do think you can find a balance. I understand, and we could talk about that too. I mean, I understand that you need to be doing things progressively, especially if you're working with people that have never had to engage in interpersonal violence and you want to get them to understand what it's going to be like. You need to be progressive. You can't just go and just throw people into the deep end, and if they don't know how to swim, expect them to swim. People are going to drown. I get all of that. But down the road, you have to slowly start educating people and turning their understanding of what it is about reality-based self-defense, for example, to turn them in a way that they start to understand that what's required is they're going to have to deal with things like resistance, with somebody fighting back. And in the process of doing that, they're also going to have to deal with their own internal baggage, a lot of the emotional and psychological issues they have. And all of that stuff's going to come out, and then they have to learn how to actually manage that appropriately, which never gets taught anyway. And so the easiest way to get around this is just take it out. And so you never have to deal with it.
Yeah. I think that's actually a really good segue to quickly talk about jiu-jitsu, because for me, Brazilian jiu-jitsu is, I think it created a nice doorway into that resistance for regular people, because it's not the same as being punched. It's not the same as when you first spar with a decent fighter. If you're not prepared for that mentally, it's terrifying, right? You're getting hit, you're getting hurt. The consequence can be quite severe. You can wear the consequence on your face for the next 3 weeks. You can be every time you try to chew solid food for the next week, you'll remember that sparring session didn't go well. Whereas with jiu-jitsu, you can get completely outclassed and dominated by a world-class player, and it's over as soon as the round's over. And as long as you know to tap, then you're not going to necessarily wear any badges from that. So I think that.
Well, I think I've got something to say about that, right? So it probably won't make me popular. First off,
I love it when guests start with that, because I know I'm about to get the good stuff.
Well, here's the thing, right? I totally agree with you. So I'm a jiu-jitsu black belt, as you know. I'm under Higan Machado. I've been doing jiu-jitsu. I've lost count, about 20-something years. So I've been doing it for a long time. So I totally agree with you. I'll also say this, though. A lot of jiu-jitsu people are afraid to do stand-up.
Oh, yeah.
Because at the end of the day, with all the things that you said, even in jiu-jitsu, size and strength make a difference. And so there are people that are big and strong that can get away with things in jiu-jitsu that they couldn't do if I got them to stand up and put some gloves on.
Absolutely.
And they avoid that because it's easier for their ego to deal with the ground where they can dominate smaller people with their size and strength. But it's a totally different ball game when they have to stand up, and now they actually have to do it for real in a stand-up environment where they're getting punched in the face. And so I've seen jiu-jitsu people who have practiced jiu-jitsu for a very long time literally get whatever belt they were. I'm not going to mention belts, but let's say they're up there at the top. One punch later, they're demoted back to white belt. And the reason is they don't know what it's like to get hit. And so that's always the fascinating thing to me as well, is that one of the things that I at least try to do, and I teach have people in my trainers programs, and I have students around the world that only do jiu-jitsu with me. They don't even do crazy monkey defense. But I spend a good amount of time with them actually teaching them how to deal with strikes, how to actually, engage with their grappling skills against that. And part of that is also them learning to some degree how to actually box, how to actually put those strikes into effect. Because how are you going to learn how to defeat something if you don't do it yourself? You actually need to know it. You need to have experienced it. You don't ever have to become a boxer. Nobody's saying if you want jiu-jitsu to be your primary vehicle of self-preservation, you don't have to become a boxer, but you at least have to spend a little bit of time doing it so you know exactly what it's about. And you need to know how to take a punch. Because if you can't do that, I don't care what you know in jiu-jitsu. You're going to forget everything once I punch you in the face as hard as I can on a pavement. You're going to forget everything. Everything's going to go out the window, right? And so again, this is the thing, coming back to what we were talking about. I think this is not me in any way diminishing jiu-jitsu, because if I was in a situation and I needed backup, I'm always going to call the combat sports guys, right? I'm going to rather have them in my corner. I'd stay away from the reality-based self-defense guys. I just don't trust that they can actually do anything, because everything's prearranged, everything's pre-coordinated. Everything they do is not what reality is. It's not how fights look. They just don't go down like that. Fights are untidy, they're chaotic, they're unpredictable. They don't always go the way that you want them to. And they're never going to look like that Jason Bourne movie. It's just never going to look like that. And so combat sports athletes, be they jiu-jitsu guys or kickboxers or boxers, know that. They've been in it. They know what it's like. But with that said, even a jiu-jitsu guy has to acknowledge that there's certain limitations to what they do. And to suggest, and this is, to me, is kind of propaganda that's pushed in the jiu-jitsu community, that size and strength don't make a difference. That's absolute rubbish. If I take a 120 kilogram guy who is just a monster with, inhuman strength, and I get him to grapple a 55 kilogram woman, even if she's been doing jiu-jitsu for the last 10 years, she's going to struggle. She's going to have a real hard time. And she may not be able to get out of that situation, just in a grappling situation. So now what are we going to talk about when we start talking about the reality of interpersonal violence? So that's one example. What about the other example? There is no conclusive method I've ever seen in any person who teaches jiu-jitsu where they can show me how they're going to use jiu-jitsu only, and I mean only jiu-jitsu, versus multiple attackers.
Well, you only unlocked that after your after black belt, is what I've heard. I don't know.
Yeah, the thing is, you can quickly test that. It's real simple, right? You get, if you run a jiu-jitsu academy, put one of your students on the ground, get 5 other people just to do jiu-jitsu against them, just to grapple against them, and see how long they last. Yeah. It's not going to go the way that you think it's going to go. So what am I saying there? What I'm saying there is, as a jiu-jitsu practitioner, what I should learn to do is, if I'm on the ground, faced with multiple attackers all trying to kick me in the head, wouldn't it be a good idea for me to learn how to get back up to my feet quickly and effectively? Yeah. Once I'm back on my feet, wouldn't it be a good idea then to learn how to use those people as barriers against each other so that they can't get to me? I mean, do I really want to sink in a guillotine choke while 4 other people hit me in the head? Yep. I mean, this is just the reality, right? And that's not to say for one second that there is absolutely no value in training that, because that's the other side of it. We have all these reality-based self-defense people who don't spar, who say that those guys, the jiu-jitsu guys, the kickboxers, the boxers, the MMA guys are all sport, and they do sport and we do street, which in itself is just tells me that they don't understand interpersonal violence, because what they are teaching and the way that they're teaching, it's not how fights look. We've said that already, right? Yep. Fights look like bad boxing, bad kickboxing. So what if it looks like boxing and it looks like kickboxing, or bad grappling? If it looks like grappling, why not train those things? Why not be really good at them? Learn how to deal with a resisting opponent, because that's where you're going to learn. Learn how to come back from losing, because that's where you're going to learn. Get your attributes up, speed, power, timing, because that's where you're going to develop them. And then just make the appropriate adjustments under a skilled coach who can show you, okay, you've got those skills. Now this is the things we need to change in order so that you can survive interpersonal violence out on the street and not in the ring. And that doesn't seem like such a difficult thing to do, but somehow I never see that come out. I never see it on these videos.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of reasons why, and most of them are rooted in ego and insecurity, I think. But that's actually probably a decent segue to the second thing that we wanted to talk about. So I'm curious. You said at the very beginning that you didn't excel academically, but I introduced you as Dr. Rodney King. So how did that come about? I know you completed your PhD a couple of years ago, and you've now written a book, Full Contact Living. So what was that journey from surviving the streets of Johannesburg, military service, bouncing, boxing, fighting, martial arts coach to now PhD and I hate using the term life coach, or performance coach, I guess. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, the thing for, getting a PhD was just me trying to prove all my teachers wrong. Because I remember coming up in school and them telling me I was an idiot, I was useless, I spent too much time staring out the window and I was never going to amount to anything. And that basically I would, leave school probably with not much of a future. And in some ways they were right. It was out of my control. As I mentioned right at the beginning, my mom kicked me out of the house, right? There was no choice. I was out and that was it. And I never finished high school. So that's the thing. And so once I established myself and I felt that I was doing okay financially and I was being relatively successful, I made it a mission in my life to go back to school and get that education. One, because I wanted to prove everybody wrong. But two, I really enjoyed the process of learning as an adult, but didn't enjoy how it was set forth when I was a kid. I didn't really appreciate the schooling system and the way that they made you learn, which basically anybody that's been to school will agree with that, is that school just kills your creativity and it kills your desire to learn. But as an adult, I got to choose what I wanted to learn. And that was the cool thing, right? So then that's why I put myself back into school. And as you noted a couple of years ago, I was awarded my PhD, which is probably one of, definitely up there as far as life achievements, definitely one of the top ones.
Yeah, I think it's certainly one of those achievements that everybody recognizes the value of. Working for a guy with a PhD, I'm painfully aware how much higher he's built out than I am. So I think the PhD is it's like the black belt of academics, but it's a black belt that no one goes, oh, you're a Taekwondo black belt, well done. No one cares what your PhD did.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I mean, the thing is, when I decided to go and, take on that journey of doing my PhD, I wanted to do something that really interested me and something that I felt would change my life for the better. And it was already coming out of experiences that I was having before that. And I went on, my topic of research was, in a simple way of describing it, was mindful leadership. So I looked at mindfulness, the role of mindfulness in leadership performance. But as a martial artist, we are very well aware of what it is to be in the present moment. One of the things you learn very, very quickly is that, especially when we're talking about sparring is a good example, just sparring, rolling, free rolling, same thing. If you're not completely there, it can be a terrible experience for you.
Oh, yeah.
It could really suck, right? Your inner demons creep in, all the stories you tell yourself, all the self-doubt is painfully evident in your mind's eye. And so if you follow the process properly and you learn ways to manage that more effectively, you start to get this idea and recognize that being in the present moment is one of the best places to be in the role, in the sparring match. And we can make the argument as well as that, when we talk about self-preservation, it's no different. And so I really wanted to focus on that. I really wanted to find out more. And so I went down the academic route, which got me to do the research. And as a social scientist, I was able to do some really great research and find out what I really wanted to know. Does it actually apply across the board? Is performance, regardless of which environment I'm in? If I approach that environment in a certain way and I apply certain key insights, will that enable me to perform in that moment? And my research pretty much showed that that's the case. And something we could talk about, but I've been lucky over the years to work with such a wide group of different students, from special force military operators, law enforcement teams, close protection groups, all the way down to working with cabin crew, and teaching them how to deal with disruptive passengers. And a big part of that is about your mindset and how you show up in that moment. And if you can do that appropriately, you're able to manage the situation, not only yourself, but the situation itself. And so that kind of, I guess in a way, you know, you were talking about finding that Miyagi moment. That was for me like really finding that Miyagi moment, at least from a research base. And so then I could say, okay, you know what? I don't just know this intuitively. Actually, the research backs up what I have to say, and here it is.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that I really like, I had Mark Denny from Dog Brothers on the podcast a little while ago, and I love his quote, "Higher consciousness through harder contact." I love that because having had a stick swing past my head, it certainly puts you in the moment because if you think about anything else other than where that stick is going, you're going to end up having a very bad day. And I think the application of that mindset of being in the moment, being mindful is critical. How did you go about, I guess, teaching those lessons that some martial artists, or at least experienced martial artists, take for granted, teaching those to people that don't have that context?
Sure. I think you kind of hinted to it, right? Is that a lot of realizations through those experiences, you start to realize that if you approach it in a certain way mentally, that the outcome is going to be a lot better. Those is obviously being more present. But that's just through experience. You know, you just kind of through osmosis, you figure these things out. The question really is, can that be taught? Can you actually teach that to somebody? And if you can teach that to somebody, what is the outcome then? I think part of the thing that I approach, the way that I do it, is I make it part of the experience. I make it purposeful. We actually make it as a central part of training, not just something that's going to happen by accident, but the training from the beginning. And we can go into, and I'll be just kind of about it, but there's specific kind of approaches that I take with students to get them to fully understand this idea. One of those is what I term grounded thinking. And what I mean by that is that most people, if they're honest with themselves, cannot find the separation between what they think and their observing self, that side of them that's actually able to observe their thoughts. What I mean by that is most people think that their thinking is real. That is the reality. And in actual fact, once you start developing the capacity to be aware of your thoughts without judgment, you're able to just notice them, you start to realize that you are not your thoughts, and that thoughts are really just fragments of history. And once you get to that point, you have that realization and you can make that distinction, you can take that step back, which in academic terms is often termed the observing self, because I can actually observe my thinking, my feeling, my sensations. Then we can actually start about it. And so that leads us into this idea of being mindful. What is mindfulness? I mean, mindfulness, simply defined, is one, being in the present moment. But crucially, what defines it as being mindful is that you are present without judgment. And so that's where where I'm talking about this thinking process. What people tend to do is when they are in a situation that feels uncomfortable, they're going to have thoughts. And when they have thoughts, they're going to try to justify why they're thinking in a certain way. And if you look very closely, you start that most of the thinking that you're doing in those situations are either holding on to the past. So maybe you're reflecting on a similar situation before that is similar to this. And then you kind of noting how badly you did the last time around when this situation showed up for you. Or you're worrying about what's going to happen in the next moment. You're worried about the consequences. So then you're in the future. Being mindful is being present, so in that present moment, but crucially without judgment, so without creating a story or a narrative around it. And so that's the thing that you realize in sparring, right? In martial arts, if you are doing, actually on the mat and you're actually engaging with another person who is not telling you what they're going to do, is that you quickly realize that, sure, you can be thinking about how you just messed up, or you can worry about what's going to happen next, but that doesn't stop the person from punching you in the face, right? Yeah. In actual fact, you quickly realize is that the more you start worrying about what just went wrong or worrying about what might go wrong, you move further and further away from the experience and you get punched more in the face. And so that's the lesson, right? That's the lesson of saying, okay, I can acknowledge that I'm thinking or feeling in a certain way, but I don't have to entertain it. I don't have to create a story around it. I don't have to justify it. It just is what it is. It's thinking, it's feeling. And if I'm able to just observe it in that way without that judgment criteria, now I'm being mindful. And the outcome of that is that you start to realize that just because you're thinking or feeling a certain way doesn't define the outcome of your performance. And I can give you a concrete example of that, right? So for many, many years, I still do, but I traveled all over the world teaching seminars. And I would step onto the mat after my seminar and I would spar with everybody. Doesn't matter who they are. Some of those people were just brand new, never done any kind of, boxing in their life before or MMA. Some of them went on to fight in the UFC and so forth. Does that mean that I'm totally 100% confident and I'm not standing there and having self-doubt? I mean, there was lots of times I'm thinking to myself, why the fuck are you doing this? Like, why are you actually putting yourself in this place? Yep. And then you start trying to find any excuse not to do it, not to go up against that guy. That's what I mean in that moment in time where I started to learn to take a step back and recognize that I was thinking or feeling a certain way, taking a deep breath, not attaching to it, not creating any more story around it, kind of short circuits it then, and stepped onto the mat, even though initially I can, you can feel the way that you're feeling, but still perform at a high level and come out doing pretty well. And so that was the realization for me that just because I might have started off before I stepped on and touched gloves, thinking in a way that was defeating or feeling in a way that I was attaching a thought process to it that made me feel like I wasn't going to do well, that didn't have to define the outcome of that experience. But the only reason it didn't define the outcome of the experience is I didn't create a story around it. And most of us spend our entire life creating these narratives that hold us back because we believe that the narrative is real. We believe that that is reality, where actually it's just a story that you created. And once you realize that they're just stories, then you don't have to entertain them. You can take that step back, see them for what they are. You can laugh about them. You can joke about them. You say, well, there's that story that always pitches up, as it always does, and just get on with what you need to do because you've learned to realize that you can take that space and that distance and take that step back. You're not basically intertwined within that thinking process where you feel like you're just part of it, like you're moving down the river and you can't actually get to the shore. It's the difference is I'm standing on the shore and I'm looking at the river and I know that it's a river and I'm not caught up in it.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I'm really fascinated by performance psychology, and a large part that I keep coming back to is this idea of detachment, and being able to detach from your current circumstance, look at it objectively, and consciously choose a different route.
So I would say something there, right? Maybe a better choice of word would be not to call it detachment, but rather acceptance.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
Because I'm not trying to detach myself from my thinking process. I'm not trying to detach myself from the way that I'm feeling. What I'm doing is I'm accepting the way that I'm thinking and I'm accepting the way that I'm feeling. Yes. And it's in that acceptance that I'm able to do what I need to do. The part of this problem is what I always have in interviews is that it's very, very difficult to bring this across because language fails these ideas and these processes. It's an embodied process. So I said, briefly, I said, well, if you want to define what my PhD was about, it's mindful leadership. But actually, that's not the title. The main title is mindful embodied leadership. And the reason why the embodiment is there is because you have to experience it for yourself. We can sit here and we can, rationally talk about these ideas, but what does that fundamentally mean to you until you're actually on the mat with me and I can take you through several drills that make that this idea is concrete for you. And where you're going to have that sense of knowing what it is, it's not going to come from your rational mind, but rather from your body's natural intelligence. Your body is going to tell you that it's working, not your head. Your head might acknowledge that it's working, but it's going to start in your body. I mean, if we just look at the history of mindfulness, and it's a big buzzword and it's all over, what has always fascinated, me is that we in a situation where we're always trying to strip it away from its origins. But if you look at mindfulness from a Buddhist tradition, the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama, made a very main point about this. I mean, he was very strong on this, that he said that you cannot experience mindfulness unless you experience it through the body. That's one of the reasons why I believe that the martial art experience is a powerful vehicle to teach these inner management tools, one of them being mindfulness. There are other ones. But because you're using the body as a vehicle to experience it, it has got much more profound effect than if I just told you what it is. because just me telling you what it is doesn't give you an idea of how to practice it. On being on the mat with me, actually going through the experience, through a martial arts experience, shows you how to practice it. So as much as I, try to get it across on interviews, it always fails because the body doesn't have that kind of language. The body doesn't really have a language per se. We try to explain it to ourselves later on. We try to make sense of it, but the body knows. The body is pre-verbal, a way we could describe it, and this might be very technical, but we can say that it's pre-verbal consciousness.
Yeah.
We all aware of consciousness. That's what we think about, the images we have in our head. That's our consciousness, but there's a pre-verbal consciousness that defies words. And I think in each martial art tradition throughout history, if you look at some of the great martial artists, they've all tried to explain that in their own way. But a lot of times they fail because words just don't allow them to define it the way that they would like to. And really what they want to say is, don't listen to me. Just come down and get on the mat. Get on the mat and I'll show you. You'll feel it for yourself. And so that would always be my suggestion to anybody listening to this going, well, how would I get that? How do I get the stuff that Rodney's talking about? It sounds, good in theory, but how do you do it in practice? You've got to do it under a skilled coach. Somebody who knows about it, knows how to invoke those processes, but you have to get on the mat and you have to do it. There's no other way.
Yeah. I mean, even Musashi was saying that 500 years ago. He spent years of his life trying to articulate the lessons he learned in sword fighting or real combat, and at the end of the day, the way is in doing. You have to do.
Yeah, and so even that's interesting, right? As a side note to that, many of those for example, the samurai is a good example. Many of the samurai that actually survived the battlefield, right? They weren't killed. I always found that very interesting, is that many of them went on to become monks later on, either becoming Zen or Shinto priests. Why is that? Because I think there is a spiritual component to martial arts, which sadly has been lost in our modern era of, as much as I like combat sports, it's kind of almost devoid of the spiritual side of things. And I think that's an important part of what we do. And I think that's what keeps the warrior in check and prevents him from becoming a mercenary. And you need that in order to be balanced. And I think if you go too far to the martial, and this includes for reality-based self-defense, as I would say for people who do combat sports, when all you ever do is focus on the fight, what you end up doing is just fighting all the time. Maybe not in a physical sense, but with yourself psychologically and emotionally. At least that's what happened to me, is that there was a time when I was so embedded in the fight that the way that I describe it is like being down the red road. And that's all I saw. So I was all martial and no art. Yeah. And I felt completely unbalanced as a person. Sure, can I get on the mat? Could I get out the door? Could I take people out? Absolutely. But I wasn't finding any balance in the rest of my life. I was finding that I was completely unbalanced in other things, in my relationships, in my friendships, in getting upset and aggravated about stupid things that you shouldn't get upset about, that happen just as a course of living. And so for a while there, I was just going down the wrong path. And that's kind of also led me to doing my academic work and writing the book, Full Contact Living, that you noted, was that I finally realized that I needed to come back to the art. And if we're really honest with ourselves, I said, like, one of the things that I was attracted to when I was a kid is I loved the martial art movies. But if you think about all those old Chinese kung fu movies, there's kind of like a similar narrative, right? It's this unassuming guy that's getting picked on. He feels he needs to do something about it. He goes off and he finds this master who teaches him kung fu, and in the process, makes sure that he understands the philosophy. He comes back from that experience, back into the village where all the bad guys are now taken over, and he doesn't want to fight. He's actually going to try to avoid it. He tries to talk his way out of it. He tries to basically use reason, to get out of the situation and get them to understand. And it's only when push comes to shove and there's no other option that he actually fights. And it's typical in those martial arts movies, the main bad guy, he gets into a fight with that guy, he beats him, turns his back, and then the bad guy will pull out a blade and just be, unethical and just, he doesn't accept defeat. And then the martial arts guy, the kung fu guy the hero has to do what he doesn't really want to do, is end the fight indefinitely, just basically end up killing the guy. But that's not really what he wanted to do. And so why is that there? Why is that? It's in there, not in the martial arts movies only. It's there historically too, in chivalry and in the code of the Bushido. That's not to say that every warrior followed it, but it was there. And I think the reason it was there is that it's important to find that balance. Otherwise, if we talk about the samurai, if you think about the samurai as a good example, why did the samurai elders make young samurai spend all this time on soft skills like calligraphy, theater, tea ceremony? And you couldn't just be good at it. You had to be an expert. It kind of seems like a waste of time, really, right? I mean, you are a samurai. You're meant to go onto the battlefield and wage war. You're a warrior. What the hell am I doing pouring tea? The reason you're doing that is because the elders of that society figured out early on that if you only teach somebody to fight, the very person that you have charged to protect society becomes the very person that destroys it. So rather than becoming a warrior, you become a mercenary. And I think that's the thing that concerns me the most. And I've been there, so it's not like I haven't been there, and I understand that. But that concerns me the most when I look at the kind of modern interpretation of martial arts, where it's gone completely to the fight, both in combat sports and reality-based self-defense, and the art has been left behind. And I think that has a huge consequence just in how people will deal with interpersonal violence, right? You know, if you look at most reality-based self-defense instructionals that come out, and especially the stuff on YouTube, it's always a physical response. When last did you see a video where it was like, hold on, how about we use verbal jiu-jitsu to get out of this? You know, why does it always have to go to a physical response where I use my Jason Bourne moves to kick the shit out of somebody, when actually, you know what, I could swallow my pride and my ego and put my ego aside and just apologize, even if it's not really my fault, just say sorry and, hey man, can I buy you a drink? And end the story, right? We can just carry on, and I don't even have to get into a fight in the first place. I think the art affords you that kind of mindset, that ability to do it. You know, when you talked about your Miyagi moment, that's really where the art becomes crucial in how you deal with anything in life, including interpersonal violent encounters.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the samurai and becoming monks. I noticed a while ago that the people that I knew that were really deep in, I guess, real violence, whether they were long-term doormen, whether they were soldiers, whether they were whatever, but that they'd been very, very deep down that rabbit hole of interpersonal violence. Later on in their life, there was two extremes. Either they became very spiritual, whether it's a religion or whether it's some sort of philosophy, but it became very soft and quote unquote enlightened people, or they became completely self-destructive. And it seemed like it was only two extremes. Very rarely, after a prolonged exposure or prolonged immersion in violence, does someone just end up being in the middle. They either have to go one way or the other. And I'm sure there's exceptions, but the ones that I noted were it was really evident that the ones that I looked up to that still had longevity, they really embraced their spiritual side and that I guess the soft skills, as you said, of the art and of life.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why some of those people that you described go so much to the spiritual side is because I think if they were really honest with themselves, they never found that spiritual meaning in the martial side of what they did. Is that, they could do the martial, they could do the fighting, but it never moved positively into other aspects of their life. So they felt unbalanced. And so coming out of that martial experience and not finding what they were really looking for, is they went kind of in the opposite direction. The other people that just weren't even willing to entertain that went purely into the red road, purely into the aggressive side, and went even worse than what they came from. And so it is what you said. It's about finding that balance. It's about being able to do the violence when necessary, when there's no other choice, but using that exactly as no other choice. And so where I was young and working the door, I would probably just, punch anybody at the drop of a hat, because that's where I was. Now, where I am now, that's not how I would approach it. And it's definitely not how I would want to teach people. So even my approach to the way that I teach is very, very different. People look at me like weird sometimes when I'm out teaching stuff, and I make the suggestion that actually what you want to be in a fight isn't angry, isn't pissed off, What you want to be is calm, focused, present. That's what you want to be for tons of reasons. Partly because when you are like that, you think more clearly. And so you then, for example, in a situation where you have to defend yourself, you know when to let things go. You know when to move away from that situation. You know when to now move to an exit. This is one of my pet peeves. Again, keep hitting on it over and over, this reality-based self-defense stuff, where people are doing their defensive sequence. The person that they are doing it against, at least in the sequence, clearly has been beaten, but then they continue to stomp the guy's head into the pavement. Mm-hmm. Right. Once you go to that point, let's be honest, that's no longer self-defense.
No.
And second of all, from a legal standpoint, that's not self-defense.
No, good self-defense should not leave you behind bars.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it's going to do. I would say that 99% of what's taught out there on YouTube will put you behind bars, especially in this day and age with everybody with a phone who are going to film what you're doing. I want to see you explain that to a judge. It's just not going to fly, right? So am I able to do exactly what I need to do to the point where I can get myself to a position of safety? Well, you're not going to do that if what you've been taught to do is to go into that extreme space and go killer instinct on somebody. And you and I know there are people that teach that. That's what they teach. Get into that red mist. Use the red mist to your advantage. Kill or be killed. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, what are you going to do that? You at a wedding and, somebody bumps into you? Is that how you're going to do it? Well, you can go that way, but you're going to be spending some time behind bars, as you said, right? And so you might lose everything because of that. So it's about being restrained. I think real warriors know exactly what restraint is, and they do just enough to survive a situation and then remove themselves from it. Actually, if you're really good at what you do, you shouldn't get yourself into those situations to begin with.
Yeah. And I think this is probably a topic for another discussion. But I think sometimes black and white sells so much easier than nuance, and it's this kill or be killed, or this either we're friends or we're fighting. That's not reality. I mean, even the most extreme of examples, like a home invasion. And I followed your posts about home invasions in South Africa quite intently. But even with home invasions, there's nuance in the situation. We've seen homeowners being charged with murder because they killed the person who came into their home. And look, there's even just here in Australia, there's been a few cases of homeowners killing intruders over the last couple of years, and one of them was tragic. I mean, the guy who was killed, it sounded quite plausible. He was obviously on drugs. He was a large, muscular man who was in the child's bedroom, and the father, the scuffle broke out. Somehow the guy died. I don't recall the mechanism. But in the aftermath, as the facts started to come out, the guy who was killed, the intruder, seemed like I actually knew people that knew him. He was quite well known within the strongman and powerlifting community, and had some sort of acute breakdown, and had no criminal intent, was completely unaware of where he was intoxicated, various mental illness going on, and it was a complete shock to everybody who knew him that he was in that situation. So I'm not saying that his death was necessarily preventable. I don't know. I wasn't there. But he wasn't like an armed intruder who was there to kidnap your child or to kill everybody in the house. It doesn't necessarily mean that there had to be a kill or be killed situation. Maybe it was. I don't know if it was rational. But there's so much nuance.
I think the nuances are there. Same thing. I mean, I don't know that case, so I don't really know what went down, but I'm assuming that the judge basically looked at all the facts and the evidence and thought that there was probably a time where that particular individual, the homeowner, could have got out of there, removed their child, and got to a position of safety, but chose not to and continued to engage that person that had been in their home. And that's really what it comes down to, right? So I think if you really want to be honest about protecting yourself and those that you love, nobody's saying don't protect yourself. Nobody's saying don't protect those people that you love, but know when you need to get out of there and move to a position of safety. But we also know that men have a real hard time with that, right? Our egos are huge. We don't like to walk away from a fight, so to speak. And most guys who've ever done that chastise themselves and give themselves a hard time for days afterwards, you know. And we also have this thing within the male community where, you know, we will call each other names because we did that.
Yeah.
And so it's almost ingrained in us that that's what we should do. And sadly, I see a lot of people that are teaching self-defense, basically using that as a way to get people to do things that they shouldn't be doing, right? And so when last did you actually hear a reality-based self-defense instructor say, don't engage with a threat? You know, don't be there. If you can remove yourself immediately from a fight, do it. You know, coming back to what I was saying earlier on, where I said, you know, you can go up on YouTube and you can see all these people getting into fights. Look at those fights, you know, analyze them. You'll often see, not always, but you will see a lot of times that there are moments in those fights where one person could have walked away, could have removed themselves from that situation, but they choose not to. Why? Because it's not self-preservation, it's ego defense. We need to make that distinction. I would say that most reality-based self-defense stuff that's taught is ego defense and not self-preservation. Because if it was self-preservation, I would do only what I needed to do to secure my safety. And then the next thing is get the fuck out of there. Move yourself out of that place, get to a position of safety. That's real self-preservation. That's really what it should be about. It's not glamorous. It's not Jason Bourne. It's not a Hollywood movie, but that's the reality, because things can go south very, very quickly. I might be doing okay now, but in the next moment, now he pulls a weapon into the situation. I mean, I can give you a good example of that, right? So it was actually, I think it was last year, I was in Malaysia. I was out with one of my friends. We were in a part of KL that, you know, maybe we shouldn't have been in, but I didn't realize that part. And I'm not going to go into all the aspects of it, but you know, I don't think we should have been there. But I didn't realize where we were going because we were looking for a specific restaurant, the type of food, and that was the only place that served it. And that's kind of where we found ourselves. And I was standing at the street light, waiting to cross, and a guy walked from the side. I noticed that he was walking, and he bumped right into me. So he kind of almost knocked me right over. I mean, I was aware of it. I saw him coming, and then he knocked into me. So immediately I turned towards him. I picked my hands up because I don't know if it was by accident or intentional. And he started giving me a hard time straight off the bat. He was looking for trouble. And I was immediately saying, listen, man, let's calm down. Let's talk about it. You know, I realized that you walked into me. It probably was an accident, and I'm trying to de-escalate the situation. The next thing that I notice he does is he reaches into his front pocket and pulls out a blade. It's a flick knife, quite a big one. It's not out yet, but he's got it in his hand. And I'm like, so what are you going to do with that? And he's like, just in case. So what do I do? Now, if I do what most these people teach in reality-based self-defense, what they're going to tell me is I need to do preemptive striking. I need to neutralize this threat immediately, right? That's what they're going to be teaching me. Okay, let's say I do that, but it doesn't work for me. I don't neutralize him. He looked like he was in pretty good shape. He looked like he was going to put up a fight, right? So I don't neutralize it. What's the consequences? Okay, even if I'm lucky enough to get that weapon away from him, but I end up having to use it against him, I'm going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
Like it or not, especially in a different country, right? That has a different law system and a religion that governs it. That's not going to be, you know, sympathetic to me. Yep. So what am I going to do, right? And so, or alternatively to that, I preemptive strike. It doesn't work, and he flicks the blade out and he stabs me multiple times. Maybe I survive that, but he catches me in a place that paralyzes me for the rest of my life. These are real consequences in that situation. So what did I do? I made space. He was still kind of pushing towards me. I just kept making space. I kept being calm. I kept it, just, without any aggressive language, no use of, fuck this or fuck you or anything like that. I just talked nice and calm, and I kept backing away till the point where he decided to stop. He hurled a whole bunch of racial slurs to me. I didn't react to it. I just kept walking back, noticing where I am, looking at my peripheries, seeing if anybody else is around. And I walked away from that situation, and I didn't have to engage him.
Yeah.
Is that not a victory? Is that not a victory? Of course it's a victory. Yeah. Could I have taken him? Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. But why do I even want to go there? The victory is not engaging in that fight to begin with. And so I think what I did was the best possible thing to do. I'm here to tell the story. I'm not in a wheelchair, or I'm not behind bars because I murdered somebody, because I took the blade out of his hand and stabbed him with his own weapon. Or, anything else that could have happened in that situation. I'm here to tell the story. That's a victory. That's a win. And that's what I want to teach my students.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we don't have that conversation often enough, or at least as a community, we don't have that conversation often enough. And even if something is legally justifiable, ethically justifiable, even if physically you can pull it off, you still don't want that. You don't want that life experience. I mean, the home invasion situation, the guy who killed the home intruder, he is not going to be okay with the fact that he murdered somebody in his home. Yeah, that they've probably ruined they're probably going to move out of that home. It's going to cause trauma for all concerned. Even if he got away, even if legally it was fine, you don't want that in your life. You don't want to be unpacking that for the next however long, and the ramifications of even a legally justifiable altercation. You don't want to deal with that. It's not healthy. And I think
exactly. And so I suppose that kind of leads back to what we were talking about, the red road being in the martial mindset, is that I think this is another thing that's never talked about, is that when you see a lot of times the kind of mindset and the kind of behavioral changes that these reality-based self-defense people want their students to undertake, and even just in training, so maybe they're not actually using it, but just in training, night in and night out, there is going to be a change in their behavior. I can tell you that I've seen it 1,000 times, when I talk to people around the world, and they'll admit it to me. They might not necessarily say it openly, but they'll come and say it to me behind closed doors about how training in this particular reality-based self-defense system made them more paranoid, more fearful, more aggressive, and not just in, the fact of talking about self-preservation, but just in everyday life, just in their interactions with normal people. I mean, you probably had this experience. I did, working the door for so many years. It made me very distrustful of people. I was paranoid all the time. I thought somebody was always out to get me. Somebody was always following me. And it took a long time to shake that and come out of it. And so the way that I like to approach it, these days, is I know what I need to do. I know what I can do, but at the same time, I want to balance it all the time and make sure that I have a healthy philosophy. And really, I guess the fundamental thing is, if martial arts or reality-based self-defense or whatever you're training shows up in your everyday life and is making your everyday life more positive, then it's a good thing. But if it's taking anything away from your everyday life and it's making it more negative, then maybe you shouldn't be there and maybe go do something else.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to end on for the main interview. Dr. Rodney King, thank you for your time. If people want to engage your services, they want to book you, they want to buy your products, where can I send them to find out more?
Oh, they can just go to coachrodneyking.com.
coachrodneyking.com. All right. Highly recommend you check out everything that Rodney's got on offer. I'm sure if you've listened this deep into the podcast, he's a wealth of information, both in martial arts as well as in performance coaching. So I highly recommend you check that out. If you are a Patreon contributor, make sure you head on over to Patreon for the bonus questions, which I'm about to do with Rodney right now. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you once again to Dr. Rodney King for sharing his story and his expertise on some very deep thoughts about martial arts, managing violence, and how it can improve your life outside of this tiny niche of violence management as well. It's a great pleasure having him on. Rodney also contributed bonus content. If you head over to patreon.com/managing violence and subscribe over there, you can hear the bonus content. Until next time, I'll talk to you soon.